We'll talk about David Cameron in a moment, but just to talk about someone who is still very much a member of the government first, Matt Hancock. So he owns 15% of the shares in a firm called Topwood. Now, that's a company where his sister is a director. It's also approved as a supplier for the NHS. Is that really acceptable?
Well, of course, the reason we know about this is that Matt Hancock did exactly what all ministers would do in this case, which is to declare that interest. And so he did the right thing. He's declared that. He's had no role whatsoever in any procurement around this business. So, yes, there's nothing wrong with ministers having financial interests, provided they declare them in the appropriate way. And
so as long as you declare it, you can do whatever you want.
No,
Is that how it works?
As long as you declare it and then have no role, obviously, in any procurement decisions around that company. That's the important thing here. The important thing is much more how do ministers act and conduct themselves in these situations if there is a potential conflict. Well, the thing they should do is make sure they remove all of that conflict by ensuring they have no role whatsoever in decisions surrounding such companies. But secondly, declare it so there can be no perception that they might. And so he's done what you'd expect someone to do in that case.
You say there's no perception of a conflict of interest because he's declared it. You know, I'm not suggesting that Matt Hancock's broken the rules here. As you say, he's followed the rules. But some people looking at this might think that if a health secretary can own a sizable chunk of shares in a company run by his sister that is then a supplier for the department which he is the head of, then it's the rules themselves that are broken.
Well, I'm not sure, actually, that I would agree with that. Obviously, look, ministers can move around a lot. Famously, we tend not to spend, too long in one particular role. Sometimes a minister will be given a position and may have a long-standing financial interest that they therefore need to declare. I don't think that was the case in this one, but that is often the case. And so they declare it in the usual way and then remove themselves from any decisions that might affect their own, financial interests. And as far as I can, that's exactly what Matt Hancock did. I mean, the reason we know about this, the reason it's being talked about, is because he declared it and he did the right thing.
Yeah, he did declare it. I'm not saying that that's not what he did, but at the same time, can you not understand why some people looking at this might be thinking this looks pretty off? Shouldn't there be more distance in place? Shouldn't there be more rules in place to try and make sure that these conflicts of interest don't happen whether or not they're declared?
Well, look, there's a lot of different government inquiries. So the Prime Minister set up Nigel Baldwin to look at the Greensill case in particular. There's then...
That's not looking at the Matt Hancock case, though, is it?
No, it won't, but there's also Simon Greensill's looking at the issue of civil servants potentially having second jobs to make sure that there's no conflicts there. And of course, then there are several parliamentary committees looking at this. I think the right thing to do is for these reviews to go through their process, to conclude, to work out exactly what did and did not happen. And then, yes, of course, there may come a time after that when it's right to consider tweaks to policy. But fundamentally, I think that the systems we have in place with ministers declaring interest, with the ministerial code and the focus on that and how ministers conduct themselves in office is actually a pretty good one. But that's not to say that you couldn't make tweaks or changes. And obviously, there'll be a time and a place for that after these reviews have concluded.
Let's talk about the Baldwin review, shall we? Because I understand that it is quite helpful for when ministers like yourself do these rounds, that you can point towards the fact that the Baldwin review has been set up. At the same time, though, it's got no power to sanction, no statutory or legal force, and it's strictly limited to looking at the Greensill affair. I mean, it sounds a bit toothless, doesn't it?
Well, no, I think it's actually the right thing to do because the worst thing for ministers is to say that they think everything's OK and then suddenly it turns out that there are other details that emerge. And so the Prime Minister, I think quite rightly, has said, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's have a legal professional who's a non-executive director at the Cabinet Office to really look at this and scrutinise it in detail.
But don't they need more powers? This is the point I'm getting at. Doesn't this review need more powers if it's going to be taken seriously?
Well, I don't think it needs powers. I think what it needs to do is to get to the bottom of what happened. And then, as I said, following that, if there's a general view in Parliament that the rules around declaration of ministers' interests could be changed slightly, or if there's a view that rules around what ministers can do when they leave office should be changed slightly, well, then that's a policy decision, and that's something that can be taken at the point. But this review doesn't need enforcement powers as such. It just needs to get to the bottom of what's happened.
So will you implement what the review recommends then?
Well, the review is going to establish what happened in this particular case.
I know what the review is going to do, but will you commit to implementing what the review
Well, I don't think the review is going to make policy recommendations, but of course there are other reviews going on in
so it's
Parliament.
not going to. What's the point of it then? If it has no powers, it's not going to make policy recommendations. What's the point of it?
Well, because people are raising questions about what happened in this particular instance around Greensill, both because there was a
we know the questions.
There was a civil servant, Bill Crothers, who at one point was working for the civil service and had a role in Greensill. So that is something that's being looked at. And obviously there's been a lot of questions raised about David Cameron's contacts with ministers. So the purpose of the review is to answer the questions that people are asking, but it's not really there to prescribe policy. So there are other parliamentary committees that are looking at this issue in the round, and I'm sure many of them will make recommendations on policy. And of course, government will always look very carefully at what Parliament recommends in this space.
Let's talk about David Cameron. Are you comfortable with the way the former Prime Minister has acted?
Well, look, he himself has said that with hindsight, probably would have been better if rather than texting ministers, if he had instead written letters to set out his views more formally. But I think the real point is, has he done anything wrong? Well, on the face of it, no. But, there's a review that's going on. We mustn't prejudge that.
So you don't think he's done anything wrong?
Well, look, there are rules that say the limit what a former minister or former prime minister can do for a period of 2 years. He meticulously observed those. Yes, he then took roles after that.
Did he exploit the rules? This is the thing. It's like, do you think that he took advantage of rules that many think were just too lax?
Well, I don't think he took advantage of any rules. No, he meticulously observed the rules are there, that he himself actually put in place after some concerns around lobbying a decade ago. He put in place these restrictions on what ministers can do for a period of 2 years. But look, he himself has conceded that, with hindsight, if he had his time again, he wouldn't have texted Rishi Sunak and wouldn't have texted others. He would instead have written through formal channels. But the big question is, what did then Rishi Sunak do, having been approached? The answer is, he asked the question, asked people to look at this issue. The answer came back that there was nothing that could be done for this company. The company was told, we're not going to do anything at all to help you, and the company went bust. So at the end of the day, did people give any special favours to David Cameron or indeed to Greensill? The answer to that's no.
You worked quite closely with David Cameron when you were press secretary for him when he was leader of the opposition. Given what you know about David Cameron, do you think that he's acted in a sort of calculated way here? Or do you think, frankly, he's just been a bit of an idiot?
Well, I wouldn't ascribe to either of those definitions. I think, look, he abided by the rules that he himself put in place, and so didn't take any roles for the period of 2 years after leaving office. He's been out of office 5 years now, and he left office when he was still quite young, and that's often the case now with prime ministers. And you can't begrudge people a chance to do a different career and something different after they've left that top job. I think everybody would accept that. But look, in terms of did he do anything wrong? Well, look, he himself conceded that the manner in which he approached Rishi Sunak on this particular issue on behalf of a company that he was working for by text probably was ill-advised, and probably he should have done it through a more formal route with a letter through his private office. David Cameron himself conceded that, and that he would do things differently if he had his time again.
OK. Keen to move on now to COVID. NHS providers warning this morning that it could take 5 years to clear the backlog caused by the pandemic. How concerned are you?
Well, look, this is obviously an important issue. It's been a huge endeavour that the NHS have been through to try to deal with COVID. We've tried, apart from those peak periods, the government has really tried to encourage people with other routine operations to keep coming in when they're able to, when the NHS hasn't been at those peak periods. Obviously, people have been anxious at times, and obviously at times when the NHS has been particularly stressed, they found it less easy to take forward those other operations. But I know that this will be very high on Matt Hancock's agenda as we emerge from the pandemic, making sure that we can get on top of those routine operations that are obviously so important and that have life consequences themselves.
Another issue that many people are worried about at the minute is the emergence of these new variants. We know about this variant first discovered in India. Lots of work being done to try and track exactly how much of a foothold it has in the UK. Have you got the most up-to-date figures on how many cases there are?
The last I think I saw, there were around 70 cases, but I think I've seen lots of different numbers on different variants. You'll appreciate there's quite a few. So it's a fairly small number at the moment, but it is something that we are watching. Then I'm told that there's no evidence at the moment that this particular variant is able to get around the vaccine, for instance, or indeed that it's necessarily more contagious than the others. But we are looking at it. It will be studied. We've got some of the best genomic studies available in this country. We're very good at genome sequencing for different variants, and that work is ongoing. And obviously, there's a wider concern here. The biggest threat to everything that we're doing at the moment is that at some point, there will be a variant that manages to evade the vaccine or largely evade it. So it is high on our concerns, which is why, the vaccine rollout's been incredibly successful with over 60% of the adult population now vaccinated. We continue to proceed with some caution as we come out of lockdown.
I'm interested to know why India isn't currently on the UK's red list. This is the list of companies where you're either banned from coming into the country or you have to quarantine for 10 days in a hotel. So at the minute in India, there are over 10,000 COVID cases per million people. If you compare that to 3,000 in Pakistan, just over 4,000 in Bangladesh. Pakistan and Bangladesh are on the red list, but India isn't. Can you reassure me that this is science, not politics at play here, given the Prime Minister's planning a trip to India?
Yes. So we have an expert committee that looks at this and then makes recommendations to the Transport Secretary and Matt Hancock and the group that make up the COVID Cabinet Subcommittee. They look very closely at it, and it's then discussed more widely. It is reviewed periodically, so roughly every 10 days or so they look at this. If there's a need to do something urgently, they can do that, but they do periodically review variants that are in other countries and the approach that we should take. We should bear in mind that everybody coming here needs to get a pre-departure test and also tests after arrival. So that's an approach that we take now. But for those red list countries, obviously, quarantine's also required. And I know they're looking at reviewing this to have a sort of green, amber and red approach to triage things more, because international travel is going to become a more important focal point as we come out of lockdown.
Is it really a good idea for the Prime Minister to be going to India later this month when we know that COVID cases there are surging? I know there's a Brexit trade deal potentially riding on this trip, but surely public health has got to come first.
Public health does come first, but that doesn't mean that there should be no visits at all for business purposes. And so, yes, it's already the case. People can't go on holiday. They can't travel at all on holiday. But for something like this, I think, yes, it is appropriate. But look, absolutely, measures will be taken to ensure that the visit is COVID secure, that any staff and the entourage attending with the Prime Minister will obviously be in a COVID secure environment. Extra precautions will be taken. But I think it is important that the business and the business of politics, if you like, does continue and doesn't stop completely. We just need to make sure we take the right precautions.
Just finally, the UK is hosting the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow in November. Big deal. Know how huge, of course, climate change is globally, but also for this government as well. Some are saying it should be done remotely. How committed are you to make sure it's done in person?
Well, we think it should be done in person, physically. I mean, there is a COP secretariat or a COP bureau that ultimately makes these final decisions, but they do so in very close cooperation with the host country. We delayed it, obviously, last year because we wanted it to happen in person. I think it's much more effective if it does happen in person. That's absolutely our intention. There may be components of it that are part virtual, that some people attend virtually, but we think for the main Leaders' Summit, we should try and make sure that it happens in person, and that's our intention.